So just thinking about the idea of Adam and Eve, how do we then see this idea that we had these first human beings who fell into this sin? How did those first human beings arise in that sense?
Yeah, given the theory of evolution, which has increasing evidence, particularly of the study of the human genome and genes in general, showing that there's genetic patterns between species that are very like the genetic patterns between me and my brother. So just as you look at the genetic pattern between me and my brother and you would say, hey, they are both MacKenzies, they both come from the same parent, you can do analogous things with the genetic patterns between a cranberry and a raspberry and between a dog and a cat. So the evidence is increasing for evolution over time. We know there's a basic unity and harmony in the physical universe, but this also has a direction and a sense of development in the universe, particularly when you look at the human brain. When you look at the brain within living things, it seems to become more sophisticated when you have a more sophisticated behaviour pattern of the living thing with regard to its ecological niche, with regards to its environment. So there is within evolution this development of brain in balance with the programming environment. But it's always in balance, as modern science is increasingly showing us. However, the brain develops in evolution faster in its capacity to control the organism than does the wider environment, which has a lesser, slower development and power to control the brain. So we would expect there to come a time where the power of the brain outstrips the power of the environment to control it and to program it. And if this whole thing is under a plan of God, is under a wise order, we would expect there to be something else within this plan, to control the brain, to sweep the brain up to the level of being able to directly commune with God, because that's the purpose of the whole thing. So we would expect the human brain to receive a further principle to control it, to give it that extra balance, ecologically, analogously, ecologically, and certainly environmentally. And that seems to be what we see, because we see at some point a species came into the world that buries its dead, and that can start to think beyond limits. And I'm definitely one of those members of that species, because I tend to think towards the absolute. And I tend to contribute to going to the moon, to escaping my environment. I tend to not be satisfied with a purely physical, ecological niche, which animals are. So I think that's evidence that something new has happened, as you would expect under this law of the evolution of the human body, that a new principle has been created into this species, a principle directly in the image of the creator of it all, the loving, knowing and willing creator of it all. We are knowing, knowers and willers, because at an appropriate, harmonious, ordered, almost lawful point within evolution, the brain got too big as a result of a mutation from whatever the previous species was. And at that moment, within the plan of God, he infused a soul into each individual member of that species.
So would you say that gives us the ability then to think outside our environment and allow us to, engage in, for example, maths and poetry and this sort of thing that we don't see in the animals? So in that sense, there's this significant difference between us and the animals in that regard.
Yeah, I think so. I think you can see that in the human species. You can see that we act very differently from animals. A lot of our behavior is harmonious with animals. And the big question is there certain aspects of human behavior which are of a different kind to animal behavior? So in our Catholic tradition, we used to say, well, abstract knowledge is of a different kind to the knowledge. The fact that we have concept of things like hoarseness. But what we found actually, perhaps in modern science, is that actually animals seem to have something going on in their awareness, which is akin to abstract concepts. So no longer does that process quite work. Certainly animals are aware of species and sometimes more interested in the species level than in the individual level. So a cat is sometimes more interested in just eating any bird than eating a particular bird when it chases it. And similarly, there's been experiments done showing that there can be a degree of logical implication somehow going on in their mind. Now, it's probably not the same as a human mind, because I do think the human mind is of a different kind. But it's not enough just to quote logic. It's not enough just to quote beauty. It's not enough just to simply quote music, because there are, in a lesser way, similar things in animals. So we need to think a little bit harder in the light of modern science about exactly what the behavioural, objective, observable criteria is for making a distinction between human beings. And you've mentioned some of it. I do think the maths of infinity is, for instance, relevant because that involves an absolute. Because I think what we've discovered in modern science is a deeper definition of matter-energy. And that which is material is something which exists within a specific limited environment and engages with that environment intelligently, constructively, across evolution, but according to predefined limited functions. And so if we can show human behaviors that go beyond that intrinsic limitation, then we have evidence for something that is more than matter. And the old criteria are not quite right. They need a little bit of fine-tuning, like abstract knowledge. They need to be developed into things like looking for the absolute, maybe burying dead, certainly in a religious ceremony that looks beyond death. Something beyond death makes sense to us because it's beyond that significant limitation. And similarly, I think mathematics in which the concepts like infinity or anything which iterates, it's a mathematical word beyond limits, is something that only humans can do.
Now, scientists would say that they are searching for perhaps the ultimate equation, one equation that would explain everything, all sciences. Do you think they'll ever find that equation?
I think the intuition that all of the physical world can be described by mathematics in ways that interlinks the whole thing is a good intuition, because the environment in which I find myself makes sense across space and across the time of my life and my decision making. Whether we'll ever find that, I think it's probably quite unlikely, because after all, we're within this system and there's a future to the system from our perspective, and there's more to discover. So I don't think we'll ever find the unchanging laws, because there's more to this universe that we don't yet know about. But I would say that inasmuch as my life continues in a coherent way, as Hugh MacKenzie, who is consistent with his past and coherent with his future, the environment in which I'm living out these actions and living out my life can be understood as a unity, and therefore there is a mathematical equation to describe the physical side, particularly the biological side, which is the side that's most relevant to the characteristic actions that the human takes.